We're joined now by the Roundtable, Republican Congressman from New York, Peter King, Florida Congresswoman and Chair of the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, former Director of National Intelligence, Admiral Blair, and New York Times reporter Mark Mazzetti, author of the new book, The Way of the Knife. Thank you all for joining us. Admiral Blair, I want to start with you. You were a skeptic of the drone strikes. You had a lot of criticism during your time in government. You heard what Rand Paul just said. He's still not satisfied, are you?
I think the president's announcements have taken us part of the way where we need to be with drone strikes. But I think after 4 years of experience, we need to have them turned over to the Department of Defense, where they're run under the rules of law, the rules of war, international rule of armed conflict. They fit in with our overall policies, which have short-term and long-term needs, and we would have a much better and more justifiable program.
What would really be different if it's turned over to the Pentagon? Would we know more? Would people know more about what's happening?
I think two things. Number one, they would be better regulated, run, and investigated, because the Pentagon is the department that we set up to handle weapons, whether they be tanks or planes or anything else. And we've developed a long history of procedures and laws to deal with it. Number two, I think they'd be much better integrated with our overall instruments of national power, whether it be diplomacy or economics. When they're run at a very secretive level by high-level people at the White House, they're not really worked in on a day-to-day basis with the other tools that we have to reach our objectives in Pakistan and other places.
Congressman King, does the drone program need to change?
If it does change, it shouldn't change for moral reasons. That's what bothered me about the president's speech, this moral anguishing he was going through. Listen, every cop who's faced with a decision to make a life or death does the best he or she can. And I think our country has done more than any country in the history of the world to limit civilian casualties. So I think that just offended me, that whole tone of it. As far as the policy, I understand where Admiral Blair was coming from, but I think this policy basically has worked. I know I've read Mark's book, and perhaps we can fine-tune it. We can put more emphasis on clandestine activity or actually gathering intelligence rather than relying so much on drones. But to me, I don't think the president really addressed that in the speech. I think he was coming at it more from this moral tone, which I just think was misplaced. I don't think it's called for. As far as whether it should be entirely within the Department of Defense, I really can't comment on all the details on that. I'm on the Intelligence Committee. I think it's worked fairly well up to now. I'll leave it at that. And I just know that in the White House, I'm saying this as Republican, in the White House, the effort that goes in and wherever these decisions are made as to limit civilian casualties is more probably than any in the history of the world, especially when you consider the history of warfare.
Mark, a lot of civilian casualties still. And in fact, I was struck by the fact that of the 4 Americans that were killed, 3 of the 4 weren't the actual targets. The president expresses this distaste for drone strikes, and yet he has had more drone strikes than any other president. What's going on here?
Well, he certainly embraced drone strikes as a tool for secret war, and the strikes have gone down in recent years after a real surge in 2009, 2010, and he said in his speech that he would like to tighten the rules and maybe not rely on them so much. It's still unclear, though, sort of the future of the policy. There's been this stated preference to move them to the military, although they certainly aren't ruling out using the CIA for drone strikes well into the future. Certainly, the president indicated that for the time being, at least for another year and a half, in Pakistan, the CIA will continue to run the drone program. So the rules, the real change here, I think, is still a little bit unclear.
Congressman Wasserman Schultz, the president also talked about the eventual end to the war on terror. How do we know when that's over? And do you really see that as something that we're close to?
Well, I think what the president was saying in his speech was that as we wind down the war in Afghanistan and focus on how we can eventually, I mean, obviously all of our goal would not to be in a perpetual state of war. And so the goal here is to transition the drone strike program, much of it moving to the Department of Defense, make sure it's more transparent.
But it also comes at a time when we're going to end combat in Afghanistan and rely more on special operations.
Well, that's why the drone strike program needs to continue in a targeted way. It has been successful in making sure that people who are absolutely our enemy and who intend to do harm to Americans are targeted by drones in a way that is going to not have widespread impact and make sure that we can protect Americans from the threat that these absolute terrorists who are bent on the destruction of Americans, what their intent is.
Let's move to Guantanamo. The president also said he wants to close down Guantanamo. Said that before, said it again. Let's listen to what he said.
Imagine a future 10 years from now or 20 years from now when the United States of America is still holding people who have been charged with no crime on a piece of land that is not part of our country. Is this who we are? Is that something our founders foresaw?
Congressman King, what do you think?
Again,
Close down Guantanamo?
No, I'm offended by the moralizing. The fact is, whether people agree or disagree with Guantanamo, many experts believe it did work. It was something that had to be done at the time. And if the president's had 5 years to end this, if he really wanted to, he could have moved most of those prisoners certainly out of the country. He could have sent them back to other countries. He's the one who suspended the detainees going to Yemen. I've been to Guantanamo. It's a model prison. Is it ideal? No, but we live in a very unideal world. And I think for him to be saying what people are going to think about us 10 to 20 years from now, I would say maybe they felt we prevented an attack on the homeland for the last 11 and a half to 12 years, which to me is the main obligation of a commander-in-chief. Everybody wants to close Guantanamo ultimately. But again, he's had the power to do it. He hasn't done it. And he certainly, whether or not Congress was in the way, he could have done a lot more than he has done if he was serious about it, rather than just moralizing.
The real issue here is the unlimited detentions, is it not? Admiral Blair, you were in government. You were part of the decision-making group to send some of the Yemenis back to Yemen from
Right.
Guantanamo. That was halted after the underwear bombing attempt. Where do you think we should go now?
I think conditions in Yemen have changed from that time to the point that those, and I think there were almost 100 Yemenis.
I think 80 or something like
whom
that,
our
a little more than
review
80?
determined were, in fact, not a threat anymore, ought to be sent back to Yemen. The history is that about a fifth of those whom we released in the past go back to the battlefield. So we are taking a chance that some that we release will try to kill American servicemen or Americans. But I think that is in the current situation, is a price worth paying, and that price goes down all the time as time goes by.
And that's a chance we should take?
We have 166 individuals who it costs $150 million to hold. The problem with Guantanamo, and the president believes rightfully, is that it incites our enemies. It puts our intelligence officers overseas and members of our armed forces in jeopardy because it's used as a rallying cry.
Do you think it's going to happen? Do you think it'll really be closed down?
Well,
Congress make it happen?
Congress, particularly the Republican leadership in Congress, has been absolutely opposed to closure of Guantanamo. We need to sit down, and what the president wants to do is work with Congress to sit down and find an orderly way to eventually close Guantanamo. Make sure, but the bottom line here that we need to understand the president's position is he's not suggesting any one of these 166 prisoners should be released. The plan that he has is to make sure if they are sent to another country that they either be imprisoned or rehabbed if they're rehabilitatable, and that we make sure that those that should be tried need to be tried by military commissions, but that can be done in the United States. I mean, we have to balance our values with protecting Americans.
I have to say, it's actually closer to 30% of the detainees released have come back against us. And in Yemen, I know the situation in Yemen is somewhat improved, but I am very concerned about sending detainees back to Yemen. I don't trust the government to, again, we trust them once before, it didn't work. New government, I still don't think it's strong enough to risk sending back that many detainees who could come back and kill Americans.
And what has the effect been of Guantanamo? It has, it seems, been a rallying cry.
Yeah, everything's a rallying cry. During the 1990s, the only time we used troops under President Clinton was to defend Muslims against Christians in Bosnia and Kosovo, and yet we were attacked in 9/11 by Muslims. So, I mean, there's always going to be some reason. Part of it, I think, the American media and people in politics stir up about Guantanamo. We should be proud, defend what we're doing, and stop apologizing for America.
I want to move to the leak investigation, which was quite extraordinary this week. Mark, you cover national security, you cover intelligence. What we had this week is a reporter, James Rosen from Fox News, who was looked at as a co-conspirator. What's the chilling effect there?
I mean, the big threat here is that ultimately it's the reporters themselves that are seen as the ones who are breaking the law, and that there could be prosecutions. Now, they haven't gone down that road yet, but the chilling fact, of course, with all of these leak investigations, whether they're successful or not, or whether the cases blow up, is that people who have been previously inclined to talk to reporters are less so now. And so it does affect the work that you do and all of us do. And
I guess we should say we're not talking specifically about classified material. People may not want to talk to you about something like Abu Ghraib. All
sorts of things. And if there is just the general climate of speak to a reporter and you could go to jail, this has a sort of cascading impact on not just real cases of highly classified information, but sort of low-level information as well. And if there's sort of the feeling is the government shouldn't talk to people in the press, then that's a big problem.
Okay, you've heard the press's side there. Admiral Blair, you were in the White House. The leak investigations have been quite intense in the Obama White House.
Right. And they have been directed, the ones that I knew about, mostly against the U.S. government employees who were talking with reporters, which is where I think they should be directed. I know of no institution in America better able to defend itself than the press. So I think that'll work out okay. But what I think is that the leaking at the top of this administration, and it's a secular trend, it's gone administration, is what sets the tone for those below. And I think that most of what administration spokesmen should talk about with reporters should be talked about on the record with their names attached to it, to set an example so that those further down the line don't think that leaking is the way it's done, what should be done.
Just quickly, Congresswoman, on the leaks.
The important thing is to make sure that people who should not be leaking classified information they're committing a crime. So ensuring that there is a huge disincentive to committing a crime is important. And look, the president, there's none of us that believe a reporter should be gone after for doing their job, but we do have to make sure that there is a way to hold accountable individuals who are leaking and committing crimes and jeopardizing the United States.